Our presenter this evening is Dr. Andrew Butler. His presentation on facilitating the development of students as self-directed learners ties in with our conference theme of the intersection of motivation and cognition in education. Andy is a chair and an associate professor in the Department of Education at Washington University in St. Louis. He is also an associate professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. He earned a PhD in cognitive psychology at Washington University in St. Louis in 2009 and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Duke University. Dr. Butler's research focuses on applying the science of learning to enhance educational practice with a particular emphasis on the complexity of implementation within context. He's interested in student-centered interventions that involve implementing simple but powerful principles within educational context to improve long-term retention, promote deeper understanding, and motivate engagement and persistence in the face of challenge. In addition, he's interested in helping teachers to acquire knowledge about how to use principles from the science of learning to improve and expand their pedagogy. Finally, he also investigates how technology can be leveraged to facilitate learning inside and outside of the classroom. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Butler.
Thank you so much. I just want to say I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be here with you today. So thank you to Joe, and thank you for this amazing team helping me to feel very welcome. And thank you to all of you for being here at EdCog, and for the folks watching at home and the alumni who are joining us. I really appreciate it. This is my second time coming back to EdCog. I was here in 2017. And my experience today was much like the first time. And I found it a very inspiring day where I really enjoyed a number of the workshops. When I was here in 2017, I attended a workshop led by Amy Bachai, who's giving a talk tomorrow, on multiple choice testing. And it led to the inspiration for a paper I wrote later, and also changes in my pedagogy. And I found the same thing today. I really enjoyed sessions on generative AI, as well as digital accessibility, the latter of which is making me feel a little self-conscious about my choices for my slides, but that's okay. I'm going to power through that. So I've enjoyed learning from and with all of you, and now I'm excited to have a chance to share a little bit about some of the things that I've been thinking about over the past 5 to 10 years. And that's about how we as teachers can facilitate the development of students as self-directed learners. And I use the word self-directed learners, it's a little bit more of a colloquial saying, but I may switch back and forth between the more jargony kind of self-regulated learning. So bear with me there if I slip back and forth. And I've pitched this talk as, I know here in the room and online we have teachers and educators from many different levels and many different backgrounds. So I've tried to kind of purposely make this talk a little bit superficial in the sense that I want it to be accessible to everybody. But at the same time, I'm going to try to sprinkle in some deep dives into different things. And in particular, I'm going to share with you a few data points that are new in the research that we're doing. I always like to do that just to kind of, it's fun to get people's reaction to kind of some new findings. So I'll share a little bit as we go along. I want to start by framing this with the challenge. Now, I recognize again that we have folks at all levels of education, and we're thinking about students as self-directed learners. It looks different, right? Of course, at every level of education, right? As students go on, they get increasing responsibility to direct their own learning. I'm particularly interested in the transition between high school and college. So I'm going to talk a lot about that today, but I want to recognize that there are many, change points, right, over the whole course of education that are really interesting to think about and talk about. So hopefully we'll have a chance in the Q&A to talk about some of those as well. That point where students transition from high school into university is really interesting because I think there is a point where the change is very acute. A lot of the scaffolds that exist in high school and lower levels of education really are taken off. And students are thrown into a situation where they're really responsible for guiding their own learning outside of the classroom. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we as educators, those of us in higher education, but also those of us in high school can help prepare students for that transition. So let me start with this little vignette. I'm going to read it to you. Tina has an exam in biology, easily her hardest subject, on Friday. She didn't do as well as she had hoped on the last test, even though she paid full attention in class and had reread all her notes and homework problems in the week leading up to the test. She wants to get at least a B on this test, and maybe even a B plus or an A minus in the class overall. The TA is holding office hours on Thursday, which Tina wants to attend, but she doesn't even know what to ask the TA about. Even though Tina wishes she could spend all her time focused on biology, she also has 2 papers due this week, a quiz in her psychology class, a drama club meeting, and her friends planned a movie night. So when you think about this vignette, hopefully this resonates with people in terms of the types of problems that you might have a student come to your office about. I want you to think about this vignette, and I could have put different details in here. What are Tina's goals in this situation? What types of factors are there that might influence her being able to achieve those goals? And what are some study strategy related suggestions that you might have for her? So if you had this student, Tina, come to your office, what would you tell her? How would you help guide her to be successful in this situation? So let's start with goals. Let's do a little audience participation. What kinds of goals do you see going on here? Or maybe you wanted to answer the other part. All right, let's start with the other part. Okay. So here we're focusing on her planning, right? And the types of learning strategies that she's using. And maybe those are ones that are less effective or have limited effectiveness, and then you need to move beyond and try other strategies. It's great. So we're going to talk a little bit tonight about planning and how to plan for learning and effective and efficient learning. I like it. Other kinds of things. What about her goals? Let's talk about her goals a little bit. Yeah. So she's balancing a lot of things, right? She's certainly got academic goals, but clearly she's got social goals, right? Personal goals, other kinds of things going on. So we'll talk a little bit about goals tonight and how those goals might affect students' behavior. All right? Other kinds of things that people recognize in here that are usual problems. Right, so we have all kinds of emotions involved in this. We also have pieces about, right, being able to attend to personal goals there with sleep or other kinds of things like that. Time management, to me, is a big thing here, right? So I think we as teachers need to think about what we can do in this situation to help learners, right? So let's zoom out for a second and look at kind of what we know about how students learn outside of the classroom. And this is definite big bird's eye view here. So one of the things we know is that students are really knowledgeable about the in-class behaviors that contribute to their academic success. Students know that they should come to class, generally speaking, although I know this morning we had discussions about sometimes students not coming to class these days. They know to come and pay attention, to take notes, et cetera, right? If we move outside of the classroom, we know that students who regulate their learning tend to have better educational outcomes. So there's a whole host of research that suggests that when students engage in effective regulation strategies, they achieve at higher levels. They also have a lot of other wellness and physical and mental outcomes that are good as well. However, it's clear that students sometimes or oftentimes regulate their learning outside the classroom in suboptimal ways. And this is what we're potentially seeing in this situation with Tina. But we shouldn't blame students here, right? Because we also know that students seldom receive any formal instruction about how to learn effectively. And that goes right across the spectrum in education at every level. Now, we do have some things that we stand up, like learning to learn classes and other kinds of things like that, but those are oftentimes remedial classes, right? And positioned as such, rather than something that everybody can learn and everybody can get better at. So what I want to do today is talk about improving self-directed learning and really think about how we can translate some of the research that exists into practice. What do we know about what works? What can we as teachers do to facilitate this set of knowledge and skills in our students? So I'm going to talk about self-directed learners in terms of kind of five aspects of a larger process, right? So this idea of self-directed learning, we can think about that as a cyclical process, one in which students engage, they set goals, they create plans, they monitor their learning as they go along, they seek help when needed, and then afterwards they reflect back on that process. so they can think about the next time that they have to do the same thing, right? So this cyclical process. I have 5 parts here. You could divide this into 8 parts, into 10 parts. There are all kinds of things we could do, but in the interest of time tonight, that's what I'm going to go with. So let's start with setting goals, okay? Think about what you need to do this weekend. What kind of goals do you have? Joe, what's your goal? What's a goal that you have this weekend?
Goal is to just get through all of this in one piece.
So Joe has a professional goal there of running 2 workshops and getting through them this weekend, all right?
But on Sunday, I'm also hoping to squeeze in some stand-up paddleboarding.
All right, so he's also got a personal goal of exercising and being at one with nature. I like it, okay? So you're balancing multiple goals, would you say?
It's a struggle.
All right. Well, so when we think about goals, one of the things that we know, right, is that the goals that people choose are going to have a heavy influence on their choices, their behaviors, and their perceptions of outcomes, right? Whether they succeed in a particular situation, whether they fail, and everywhere in between. And we also know that the goals that people have, right, can differ markedly, right, in terms of their specificity, the difficulty with which it would be to achieve them, the proximity, right? We might have near-term goals like this weekend. We might have long-term goals like graduating from college, and the intensity of behavior that would be involved in achieving that goal. And we also know that goals happen, as Joe was so nicely illustrating for us, thank you, in all domains of life, right? So when we think about our students in our courses, clearly they have academic goals, right? But they're balancing them, just like we are, right, with many other types of goals, well-being goals, social goals, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to focus in for a second on these academic goals, in part because kind of the field of people who study self-regulated learning or self-directed learning has really been laser focused on those academic goals and not really doing enough to consider multiple goals. But then at the end, I'm going to zoom back out and help us think about multiple goals as well. So one frame that I like to use when I think about students and their goals is goal orientation theory, which is a theory of motivation that is really trying to explain how people's goals are going to affect their cognition, their behavior, and their performance related to achievement. So these kind of academic situations. And the central premise here, right, is that people are going to engage in learning for different reasons in different situations, right? So in one course, they may have certain goals, in another course, they may have other goals, and the way in which they choose to behave, the affect that they experience, their performance, et cetera, are going to be affected by those goals. So at its simplest, right, goal orientation theory separates sets of goals between mastery goals and performance goals. Okay? Mastery goals are when students are wanting to learn for learning's sake. They're wanting to grow their competence, to develop competence and to achieve mastery of a particular domain. In contrast, performance goals are when students are caring about that end product, that grade or some kind of aspect of performance, and oftentimes in contrast to the others around them. So within goal orientation theory, people distinguish between approach and avoidance within both of these larger goal orientations. So for example, performance approach would be, I care about performance, I care about how I'm doing, and I want to demonstrate how good I am relative to everybody else. In contrast, performance avoidance would be about not wanting to be the worst. So again, I still care about my performance, but I want to avoid looking like the worst in that situation. In contrast here, in the mastery orientation, mastery approach is again this idea of developing competence and wanting to achieve mastery, learning for learning's sake. Mastery avoidance, and I have it in kind of a different font here and underlined, is because this is not always included in models within this kind of theoretical framework. But this is, and it's a little bit odd to think about because this is in situations where people want to kind of avoid losing mastery or avoid failing to achieve their potential. And this is one that has been studied probably the least of any of these orientations, and is oftentimes kind of left to the side, but I wanted to include it for inclusion's sake. Now, when we're thinking about these different goal orientations, right, they align with the kinds of motivations that students might have in particular courses. And what you can imagine here is that people, when they have a mastery goal orientation, oftentimes have a host of better outcomes. They achieve at higher levels. There are also mental and physical benefits, a host of other kinds of good outcomes that go along with that type of goal orientation. Performance orientations can be a little bit different. So the performance approach one is kind of a mixed bag. When students are wanting to be the best and to demonstrate their performance right relative to everybody else, that can lead to achievement at high levels. It can lead to some good outcomes. But as anybody who's been in a situation in which there's competition and winners and losers, it can also lead to some negative outcomes as well. The one we really want to avoid here is the performance avoidance, right, where students are really trying to avoid being the worst. So I like to think about these goal orientations in the sense of thinking about my students and their goals, right, and helping them think about the goals that potentially unconsciously they have in that situation and the way in which they're motivated. Now, we as teachers, I don't have time to go into this, can do a lot about how we construct learning environments to move people towards kind of a goal, mastery goal orientation, or to at least to create an environment in which such an orientation would emerge. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that in the Q&A if that would help. Now, when we zoom back out and talk about goals and the different kinds of goals, even if we're talking about just 2 academic goals, one of the things to remember is that students are trying to achieve all these goals at the same time. So when we can create situations, or help students create situations for themselves, where you have goal facilitation, where achieving one goal, right, or working towards one goal helps with working towards another goal. So a great example would be, right, if people have social goals and academic goals, have an aspect of group learning in your course, or suggest that to them as they study outside of the classroom. Achieving 2 goals with one, right? The issue comes up, right, is when you have goal conflict. And this is where multiple goals and achieving them are incompatible. And so students have to choose one or the other. And what this oftentimes does is lead students to give up goals, right, or fail to achieve them. I want to show you a nice data point, because when I think about this, I think about the situations that we all go through in terms of this goal conflict. So we conducted this study just recently that's an experience sampling study. So we have college undergraduates, and they agree to be in the study, and then we ping them on their phones from time to time just to see what they're up to and ask them some questions. And we asked them a lot of different questions. I'm not going to tell you about everything today, but one of the things we're interested in this study is about these goal conflicts and when they're experiencing them. So here's some data here. Let me walk you through this because it's a little bit complicated. On the left-hand side, we have situations in which we are talking about them as a want conflict. On the other side are should conflicts, right? So we might be in situations in which we're doing something, but we want to do something else, okay? And we can differentiate. There's research to suggest, right, that this is a place to differentiate, right, where we feel like we should be doing something else. We may not want to do it, but we feel like we should do it, right, or vice versa. So what we're doing here in this, and what I'm showing you in this data, is asking them what kind of a context they're in, okay? So down the left-hand side, it shows, right, whether they're in an academic context, so they could be studying, or in class, or in a social context, right? They're doing some kind of group activity with friends, right? At a movie, or having dinner, or what have you. Or a personal context, doing something for them, right? It could be something as mundane as brushing your teeth, or paddleboarding on a lake. And what you can see here in the green is when they answered no to that question. So what I want to highlight from this first set of graphs on the left is that what you see people being in want conflicts in is when they're in an academic context, right? Oftentimes they're doing something academic, but they really want to be doing something else. Some of the time that's something else academic, okay, but it's also personal or social kinds of things. Whereas if they're in a social context, personal context, they very rarely are exhibiting those kinds of want conflicts. In contrast, you look at the should conflicts, right? And there, when they're in the academic context, they don't oftentimes feel like they should be doing something else. They feel like they should be doing what they're doing. But oh, they would like to do other things, right? They feel like they should be doing other things when they're in the social context or the personal context. And we can resonate with this, right? This is this feeling of being out to dinner, but there's that email you need to answer, right? Or, right, I mean, I can give a lot of examples here. But these are the kinds of experiences that the students are having, and these conflicts come with a lot of emotion, right? And really do contribute, I think, to stress and other kinds of things. And so helping students recognize and reflect upon the places in which they're having conflicts and using that potentially as a source of motivation for thinking about changes in time management or revising goals as appropriate, right? I think is a nice leverage point there. Okay, that was goals. People okay? All right, let's talk about planning. Planning is my jam. This is what I spend a lot of time thinking about. How do we help students plan? Plan for learning, and then what do they actually do when they carry it out? So there's a lot of work on kind of the strategies people use, but less work on the kind of holistic plans that students make. And so I'm going to start a little bit with the strategies, but then I want to talk about kind of those larger plans, okay? How people are going to select certain activities to engage in, structure those activities over time. This is analogous to designing learning experiences, which you all do for other people, right? But this is doing it for yourself. So I'm going to show you some data from a study that we did with high school students in the state of Texas. And so we partnered with this great dual enrollment program and had access to asking some questions. Didn't have a whole lot of control, but we could insert a few questions into a survey that gathered a lot of other information about their learning strategies. So we have a sample of over almost 6,000 students from across the state of Texas. This is, the demographics of this sample are consistent with what you'd find in the state of Texas. So we have a pretty diverse sample in terms of race and gender and class, among other kind of social identity characteristics. And what we did in this study here, or this set of questions, is we asked them about what they do when they study. So we said, okay, pick a course that is typical of your high school experience. How do you study outside of class? That is, what learning strategies did you use to prepare for class, complete assignments, and take tests? Give the name of the course and then list all of the learning strategies that you used. So here we were trying to contextualize things. A lot of the research on learning strategies is decontextualized in the sense that it asks people about their learning strategies generally speaking, right? What do you use just overall? Which is a good thing to ask, right? But it's also important to understand what they do within context. Because that context may be a really important driver of different types of planning. So here we coded these open-ended response for the type of course they were taking. So these ranged from kind of English courses to biology courses to math. I mean, so we got a really a large number of different types of courses. The subject of the course, the rigor of the course. So was this just kind of a standard high school course? Was it an AP course? Was it some other type of advanced course? We coded for the types of learning strategies that they reported, and here we did kind of an inductive coding scheme, right, where we're trying to take what they're saying and do multiple iterations on coding to arrive at a set of categories that align with strategies that we know about. And then we coded also for the number of strategies listed. Let me just show you some kind of high-level results from this study. So one of the things that was really interesting was just the number of different strategies that students reported using. So what was kind of surprising to me, but probably shouldn't be, right, is that oftentimes students were reporting using one to maybe 3 different learning strategies, right? So a real kind of limited set of strategies that they're regularly using in this particular course. And if we look at the different types of strategies that they report using, right, some of the ones that clearly came through were reading or rereading materials, okay, engaging in help-seeking behaviors, and this was kind of a variety of different things, engaging in retrieval practice, which I've heard a lot of people talking about today, right, which we know is an effective strategy. There's some questions about specifically how students use retrieval practice, right? They oftentimes use it more of an end assessment rather than at the start for the purposes of learning itself. And note-taking. And then the other categories were less than 5%. So these were the dominant learning strategies people reported. And this jives pretty well with what you see in similar types of work when we get to college students, who oftentimes report reading and rereading as their #1 strategy. And I think just my personal take on that one piece is that a lot of people denigrate rereading as an ineffective strategy because there is research to show, right, that there are limited benefits to rereading. And I think that that's true. That said, I do think that oftentimes, right, students may be doing this because they need to. If they didn't read really well the first time, right, then rereading actually would be an effective thing. So I think that that's one finding, for example, that we need to understand a little bit more and understand how exactly students do that when they're reporting that they're doing it. We looked at different student characteristics to see whether that changed the pattern of strategy use. So we looked at things as a function of gender, race, parental education, which is kind of a proxy for socioeconomic status, the subject of the course, the class rigor, the reason that they reported for using a particular strategy. And what was interesting is that the pattern of usage didn't differ as a function of any of these variables. Now, I would say that given, right, the kind of limited set of strategies they're choosing from, a limited number, right, there's not a lot of variability here to find differences. So this should not be the be-all, end-all answer, right? But this was interesting. And what it suggests to me is that all students could use some help trying to further develop their ability to effectively learn using these strategies. One exception that I do want to just mention was foreign language learning, which students really seem to approach very differently than they approached other classes, which is pretty fascinating, right? There are certain aspects of education that students, I think about differently. So they really think about language learning as a skill, like riding a bicycle or playing basketball, where you need to practice in order to achieve mastery. And it's interesting that they don't take that same approach in other subjects, right, in other disciplines, when in fact what the science of learning would suggest is that, you know, the same things that are good, you know, in this context are also good potentially in other contexts, of course, adapted to that context. Two little codas here. In terms, we asked them about their reasons for using those learning strategies. Predominantly, they were saying because they're effective, they're easy to use, and they're just used to studying that way. So their perceptions of this are interesting to take into account, that they are perceiving these strategies, regardless of, right, their relative efficacy as being effective. And then I thought this one was neat. We asked them who taught them to use these strategies. And you see teachers as the #1 answer. Now, that would seem to be in conflict with what I told you just a second ago, right? About how students receive very little instruction about how to learn effectively during education. I think that isn't actually necessarily a conflict. It's that the very little that they do receive from teachers, right? And that they also potentially look to teachers as people who could help them acquire this set of skills and knowledge. So that should help us think about, right, our responsibility to help them this way. Okay, let's zoom out and talk about kind of what would be great if we could achieve with respect to planning. So one of the things that we know is that learning is complex and contextual, right? I would love, as somebody who studies learning, to be able to come up here and say, if you just do this, it'll work. But I can't, right? Because it depends, and that's the answer to everything. And what I'm trying to show here is that there's a set of factors, right? A number of sets of factors that kind of determine learning in any given situation, right? We can think about the characteristics of the learner, the knowledge that they enter into that situation with, their backgrounds, their experiences, their preferences, right? All these things matter. We can think about the types of materials, the content, the skills, et cetera, that they are needing to learn in that situation. That's going to impact how learning is achieved. The learning tasks that we design for students or that they design for themselves, what types of activities are they engaging in, and more importantly, how are they thinking during those activities? And then finally, how they're going to need to use them in the future. These criteria tasks, it might be an assessment, but hopefully we're also thinking about what they need to do after that. And as people who design learning experiences for other people, as teachers, we are fairly comfortable navigating that complexity. But one of the things we need to help students do is be able to do that themselves as well. And so when we think about navigating that complexity, we know that our goals, are to align the learning experiences that we create with the assessment, but also hopefully, more importantly, with their future needs, how people are going to need to use that information once they leave the classroom or leave this learning experience. And I like to think about at least two important parts of that alignment. One is about content, and that's about what knowledge and skills must be acquired. I think we're pretty good about that. We oftentimes are, and I think students are as well. I need chapter 3, I need to study this particular concept. The process piece is a little bit different. And this is really about how people are thinking, and I'm talking about cognitive processes here. When you're learning a set of content, you can be thinking about it in lots of different ways. And that's going to affect what is learned and what you're able to do later on. So we need to do this process of backwards design for both the content and the process and help students be able to do that too. Now I want you to be able to feel this process part, So let's do a little exercise. What I want us to do is say the months of the year together. Are you ready? January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September. All right, everybody's awake. That was really good. Okay, let's do it again, but we're going to do it alphabetically. Are you ready? April, August, December, February. Whoa, what just happened there? That was weird. What did I do? You just remember, you just listed off all the months of the year. I just asked you to do it differently. Same content. So the way that you have learned and practiced and used the months of the year, note I didn't say it chronologically, we just went to that. Of course, well, I guess I was leading, wasn't I? Setting you up for failure. But, the way we've done that is chronologically. So I ask you to think about it in a different way, and it's hard, It's different. And you've initially failed to do it. Now, you all smart people, You would have got it eventually. But you can see how we can create mismatches, And we do this as teachers. That's a whole nother, I'd love to talk about that. But students can do this for themselves as well. If they set up and plan in a way that actually does not align with the way they're being assessed, but also the way that they need to use these things later on, they can encounter those same situations. And that could be why you have a student like Tina coming to you saying, I studied so hard, I did all these things, and I don't understand why it's not paying off. So in terms of planning effective learning, there are all kinds of different things that we can do, And I like to separate these things into kind of two buckets. I like to think about activities, and I like to think about structure. So activity is about what you're doing in a given moment. Structure is about how you're structuring those things over time. So with the activities, these are not exhaustive lists. I'm just doing this for example, We can engage in retrieval practice. We can review feedback. We can engage in self-explanation, use imagery, Worked examples. There's a whole host of things that we know are effective learning strategies. I would add that some of these ones are effective in particular ways, And so again, contextual. Not every learning strategy is going to be great in every situation. Same thing for structure. We can think about spacing out learning over time, Think about interleaving, introducing variability during learning, scaffolding, fading, etc. Now, one of the things that I think is a little bit scary sometimes when thinking about all these evidence-based strategies, right, with respect to activities and structure that exist, is that planning can seem really difficult. So this is a fun paper that appeared in Science about 10 years ago by Ken Kettinger and colleagues that is really about instruction, but I think you could kind of think about it also in terms of self-regulated learning, which is to say, if we took all these things that we know work well, all these activities and all these structures, and we parametrically combine them, you'd get like 10 billion different possibilities. And that choice, right, of what to do can seem overwhelming. And I think that there's some truth to this, right? But the reality is that there's no one right way to do it in a particular situation. There are wrong ways, don't get me wrong on that, but there are many right ways. And one of the other things that we have to keep into mind is that students already have their habits and preferences. We're not starting from scratch here, right? This would kind of assume that you're starting from scratch in every situation. But even if you're thinking about instruction, some of these parameters are set for you. You've got particular content that you're using, you've got particular cadence of your course, right? What days you meet on, all kinds of things, right? That would dictate some of these choices. Likewise for students. So one of the things we have to make sure we're doing with students is meeting them where they're at, right? Taking their habits and preferences, maybe some of those might need to be changed, but really augmenting them, right? Adding to them, thinking about how we can take some of the existing things that people do and make them more effective and efficient. So I think a goal here is to kind of expand student strategy toolboxes and think about, with things like retrieval practice, for example, how you might help them use that in more effective ways. All right, people still with me? We're getting through this. Let's talk about monitoring and help seeking. I want to combine these two. So now students have made a plan and they're engaging in it, right? And one of the things that they need to do is monitor their learning, how they're progressing in their plan, and when they see situations that they need to deviate, right, they need to potentially seek help. So one of the things we need to talk about here, right, is metacognition. And I've heard metacognition talked a lot about today, so I'm sure this is something that's familiar to many people here, but let me just make sure we're all on the same page. Right, metacognition is thinking about thinking, right? It's our ability to kind of introspect on our own cognitive processes. And people who study metacognition kind of distinguish between two aspects here, monitoring and control, two different sets of processes. Monitoring processes are about people's subjective awareness and understanding of their own cognitive processes, right? And control processes are people's actions and decisions that they make in response to that monitoring to engage in different behaviors or cognitive processes. So I can give you some examples here, right? Some examples of different types of monitoring judgments, right? You might judge how easy it is to learn a particular set of material. You might judge how well you feel you know something. You might judge the completeness of your learning, right? You've read your textbook, you've done some activities, and then you might make a judgment about how well you've learned those things. You might make retrospective judgments as well about, I've offered a response and now I'm going to rate my confidence in this. As an aside, with monitoring, people are quite good at doing the retrospective judgments, right? Looking backwards after they've already performed. It's not perfect, but if we're going to choose between the two, that's the one that people are more consistently good at. When people are trying to make prospective judgments, how well I'll remember this later, how well I've learned something, oftentimes they're not as good. There are a host of different kind of control processes that we could think about, right? So in response to your monitoring, you could do things like select a different type of task or cognitive processing. I feel like I haven't learned that well enough, so I'm going to do this other activity to try to learn it better. Allocation of study time. I feel like I know chapter 3 better than chapter 4, so I'm going to spend more time on chapter 4. Termination of learning, like I'm done, I know this. Selection of a different memory search strategy. So if you're in a test, right, you might fail to remember something, and so then you're trying to, you realize, right, that you failed to retrieve, and that's your monitoring, and then you're taking a different strategy to try to retrieve that information. Okay, The issue here with metacognition, right, is that it's fallible. There are many times where metacognition works really well, right, and is very accurate and helpful to us. But there are other times where these metacognitive illusions are created. And the issue here, right, is that we oftentimes use certain cues to make these judgments, right, in our monitoring. And some of those cues are actually really poor indicators of what we're trying to judge. So what these metacognitive illusions can do is give rise to poor decisions about how to direct learning. It can lead students to think that ineffective strategies are effective. So an example of this would be when, and we've talked about this idea of rereading, right? When you repeatedly read a text, it makes you feel like you know it better. And that's because the fluency of reading is increased, and you interpret that fluency or ease of reading as like you know it. When in fact, if you took the book away, right, you'd be at a loss to figure out what was in it. And this is one of the things that happens to students, right? When they read and they highlight and they underline, and then they reread their highlighting and underlining, and they feel like they're good, and they come to the test, and then they don't end up having it. So I think one of the things we need to do is educate students about these metacognitive illusions, right? And the fact that they exist. And the fact that, you know, you should trust your metacognition to some extent, but you should always check it, right? And practicing retrieval, as just one example, is a great way to check your understanding, right? I think we also, though, need to help students understand that learning is hard work. And this, too, here, right, goes with this idea that students interpret ease in very interesting ways, right? That this is a signal that I can do it. This is a signal that I'm succeeding. And in some cases, that's true, right? But really, when you are learning and learning deeply and really stretching cognitively, right, it's challenging, it hurts. And we need to continue messaging to students about that, right? I have a 4-year-old who's learning about shoe tying, and it is really hard for him, right, to get in there and do that stuff. And that's a place where my older children who have gone through that, they're real quick, right? We're all, hopefully, those of us who wear tie with laces, are pretty quick at this point, right? You may be getting a little bit better, a little bit faster at tying your laces, but that period of learning where you're really deeply learning to do it right is difficult and time intensive. So we need to use analogies like that to help students understand, you know, what effort should feel like. We also need to help them combat it. So let me talk for a second about motivational strategies, because I think this is a really important piece. I could have put this in the planning part, but I'm going to put it here. This is another type of strategy that students need to learn in directing their learning, to deal with the challenge that either we create for them or that they create for themselves, so that they will engage and so that they will persist. And this is a kind of an emerging area within motivation research on student use of motivational strategies within the direction of their own learning. I put up here 6 examples of different motivational strategies that come from a scale that we've used in our research. I'll tell you about a data point in a second here, or a couple data points. But these strategies come from situations where they've gotten a host of students to talk about the motivational strategies they've used and kind of surfaced what those strategies would be through kind of an inductive coding process, but then also done a top-down piece where they've gone from theories of motivation, right? So you can see some of these align with different theories of motivation, like goal orientation theory, expectancy value theory for the utility value self-talk, and other ones. So it's kind of a really nice approach. And it seems like there are a lot of good validity, right, to these strategies. So let me just walk you through some of these, right? We have things like mastery approach self-talk, and I have example items. I challenge myself to complete the work and learn as much as possible, right? This is, again, aligned with this idea of learning for learning's sake. Performance approach self-talk. So this is, right, again, performance goal orientation kind of language. I remind myself about how important it is to get good grades. Utility value self-talk. I remind myself that I need to do well so I can go to college. So utility value can be about kind of a means to an end, or something that is important to one, etc. Self-consequating. So we all use this when we have to do really hard things, right? We reward ourselves. I get to watch some Netflix. I get to eat some chocolate, whatever it is that you like to do. So I make a deal with myself that I can get a certain amount of work done. I can do something fun afterwards. So this is kind of external reward structure there. Proximal goals, I break down the workload into small segments so I can get the feeling that I can handle it more easily. This is one that aligns with kind of this idea of building self-efficacy or the expectancy of success. And then interest enhancement. I think of a way that makes the work seem more interesting. And there are lots of work within the motivation literature that uses these different kinds of strategies in interventions with students, right? But here, we're thinking about them using it with themselves and having that metacognitive knowledge, if you will, about how they can regulate their own motivation and change it in particular situations. And some of these are more adaptive than others, right? So the first one here, the mastery approach, self-talk, the utility value self-talk, and then the interest enhancement tend to be three that are associated with better outcomes for students. Although it's clear that using some of the other ones can also be beneficial in particular situations, especially when it may be that a particular strategy just won't work in that situation. So we did a study, again, partnering with this dual enrollment program that I told you about earlier, where we gave students these motivational strategies, and we asked them the extent to which they use them in their learning. And so it's a different kind of a framing of a question. But what we found relative to, it was kind of interesting, relative to the learning strategies, students were pretty familiar with all these strategies and used many of them, right, in their own learning. And so relative to the learning strategies, where they used kind of a few learning strategies, here they were using lots of different motivational strategies. This is a bigger sample because the program grew, which was nice. So here we have over 23,000 students, same kind of demography. What was interesting here is when we did the same kind of analysis and looked at some of those student characteristics, what we found was that across the board, those 6 strategies, students used them more if they identified as female, first generation, or from a traditionally marginalized racial and ethnic background. And this is interesting. We're asking these questions and kind of interpreting the results with a strength-based approach, right? And so what's clear is that students with these social identities may, because of systemic biases, right, that exist in our education system, encounter more challenge as they go through. I think that these results speak to the resiliency of these students, right, and the fact that they have this knowledge about these strategies and can use them to overcome those challenges. What was interesting, I don't have time to get into, was that the specific pattern of strategy usage differed a little bit in terms of by social identity group. But again, I want to emphasize, right, that student resiliency piece and kind of how this highlights the contextuality of motivation regulation. So we need to do a lot more in this space to kind of understand. We were kind of limited in terms of even how we asked the demographic questions because that was under the control of this program. And so I think that there's work to be done in this space to really understand these results in more depth. One final thing to mention is that the students increased their use of these motivational strategies over time. So we had a longitudinal piece to this as well. And this was, they were engaging in a really challenging educational program in terms of taking these dual enrollment courses. And so what this suggests is that students are using these strategies more as they encounter greater challenge as they progress through education. One coda before I go on to talking about the last piece, which is self-reflection, is this help-seeking part, right? And I think this is a place where we really need to help students as well, and potentially help them in a different way, right? There are lots of different ways to seek help. Teachers, friends and classmates, using textbooks, the Learning Center at your university, right? Google, other things. And this is not an exhaustive list, obviously. The teacher is one of the big ones, right? And one of the interesting things that's different about help-seeking strategies and help-seeking behaviors, right, relative to other aspects of self-directed learning, is that there is inherently a social component in this. And so as we think about teachers being people who are going to facilitate help-seeking, it's really important to think about our role in creating an environment in which students will seek help. And so one of the things we've been interested in my research group is how teachers can influence help-seeking. And so we did a qualitative study that did interviews and focus groups with students to kind of ask them about the qualities of teachers that help them feel comfortable approaching them and seeking help. And a couple of themes came out loud and clear here. And really, I mean, I think the overarching theme here is a student-centered approach to teaching. But things like getting to know the students personally, being willing and available to help and signaling that in everything that you do, exhibiting positive affect, being concerned about student well-being, and being somewhat flexible with policies and procedures. So this help-seeking piece is an interesting piece, and one that I think is in need of further study as well. Let me just touch on reflection, and I think there, right, this is the piece that we don't do enough of. Any of us in our lives, right, is when we're done with something, thinking back to how it went, right, and what we would do differently the next time. And, you know, students, I think, don't do this enough either, right? So do they periodically take time to evaluate and reflect? Did I achieve the goal I set for myself? Was the plan that I created a good one? What could I change to make the process easier or better next time? And I think that we, as teachers, need to help facilitate this, right? And we can do this by creating wrappers, right, around activities or assessments or other kinds of things, right, after an exam. Help students reflect back on the process that got them there. Give them practice doing this, right, with the goal of helping them take that and expand that as something that they do regularly in all their courses, in all the things that they do. All right, let me finish up by saying, right, we've got a lot of things that we could potentially change here, students, right, and things that we can think about. Change is really difficult. As Joe highlighted earlier today, right, when people are presented with situations in which they have to engage in behavioral change, and there's a path towards more difficult, a path towards less difficult, people oftentimes choose the less difficult route, right? I think one of the things that we oftentimes do in this arena, but in many others that involve behavioral change, is try to get people to change everything, right? Dieting, like just stop what you're doing and do this. And we know from the science of behavioral change in all these other domains, right, that that's not a good recipe for doing things, right? People who try to wholesale change their diet, right, end up oftentimes right back where they were. So what I would like to suggest is that we take a different approach here. And that is that instead of asking people to change everything, we start by making one little change, right? And helping students to take what they do already, which, you know, is effective to some degree, and thinking about one piece that they can add on. All right, let me recap really quickly some of these best practices, and we can go a little bit more in depth because I'm going along here, right? We need to help students learn to set goals. It's something we can do within each of our courses. Teach students about effective strategies for learning and motivation, so expand their toolkit. Facilitate self-monitoring and self-reflecting, right? So in the moment while they're learning, but then afterwards as well. Encourage appropriate self-seeking. And then we can also model elements of self-directed learning in the ways that we teach, right? We can talk to students about ways we approach things and our reflections on those and the things we're going to change, right? And make sure that they're seeing us do those same very things that we're asking them to do. I would couch this in, in talking about what individual teachers should do in thinking about there are larger systemic things we need to do. I mean, really, this is a set of skills and knowledge that should be developed all across, right? As students go through their process of education from very young, right, until whenever they stop. Well, they never stop learning, right? This is lifelong learning skills. All right, I will end there. I want to thank a few people, some doctoral students, current and former, who helped carry out this research: Cynthia Alarcone, Emily Ean, and Rachel Martin, and then 2 postdocs, current and former, Yeon Kim and Christina Zepeda. And then a couple of colleagues and collaborators, Rohea Ameski, Julie Schell, and Matt Gianni. Let me thank my funding sources, especially the James S. McDonald Foundation, which bankrolled a lot of this research. Thank you, JSMF. And I want to thank all of you for listening and being here. Thanks so much.
We have time for some Q&A. While you're thinking about that, I might have a quick question for you. So I think colleagues at Washington University St. Louis, Mark McDaniel and Gina Fry, they ran this study in a chemistry class where on the first day of class, they ran a test to see if students are more likely to memorize examples versus kind of trying to understand and abstract the general principle. And the fascinating thing about that study was that they found that that could predict their performance on the final exam. So this test had nothing to do with chemistry, but by just identifying, are you one to just memorize examples and hope to recognize on the exam, or are you trying to actually understand the underlying principles? The relevant part here is that when they try to train people who just memorize examples to become generalizers, abstractizers, they were unable to do it. So my question for you is, in the best teaching practices, what makes you feel optimistic that we can change student motivation for self-directed learning?
Let me answer that in a few different ways. I mean, one is that it's interesting within that particular context, and I would agree also many contexts, that being an abstractor might be beneficial. But there could be other contexts in which being an exemplar learner might actually be beneficial, right? And so, first of all, I want to make sure that we frame it as being, right, one is better than the other. Obviously, in that particular situation, you'd want to move students more towards one way than another, right? And you'd want them to be flexible about that. I think it's tricky because, and I forget exactly what Mark and Gina, like the duration of the intervention was, but some of these things are ways in which students have thought about things for a whole lifetime, right? And the idea that we're going to move the needle on some of these things, I think there are other ones we can, right? Within a span of a one session or a few weeks or other kinds of things, right? Maybe overly optimistic. And maybe they're not movable, right? But I don't think we know that yet for a lot of these things. And I do think that there are a number of them that research would show are very movable, right? Both in terms of, it's very, people have shown that it's much more easy to give people knowledge, right, than to change their behaviors. And so having that, I think the real thing that people are grappling with in kind of the intervention work in the field is how you change that behavior piece, right? Because knowledge is a necessary but insufficient condition for that behavior change. Great question.
Hey, Andy.
Hello, Carl.
Thanks for, first of all, like a great presentation. And I really appreciate your holistic perspective on, and I think I can't imagine any student who wouldn't appreciate that either. And then,
but
no.
Oh, sorry.
The one thing that really stuck out to me from your presentation was the want and should conflict. I have a ton of questions about that. And maybe the one that I'd love to hear about the most is, did you by any chance measure how those conflicts might have impacted their enjoyment of their ongoing activity?
Their enjoyment?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what they're currently doing.
I got a paper for you.
Yeah.
Yes, we have. I mean, so we measured a whole host of emotions that they were experiencing, and so we were really interested in their momentary motivation and emotions in the potential presence of those conflicts, right? And how whether they were in a conflict or not, right, gave rise to those emotions. And what I would say is, yes, I mean, what you expect is what we found, right? And I'm speaking in broad strokes, but when people were in conflict, it was associated with a host of negative emotions, right? And you can imagine how that contributes over a longer span of time to students, stress and mental well-being. Yeah, that's a great question.
Hi, Andy. Thanks so much for your talk.
Yeah.
One thing I noticed that you mentioned the goal of aligning learning, not just with assessment, but with future needs. I was wondering if you could expand on that area of future needs and maybe give more examples to clarify.
Yeah, good question. So there I'm really thinking about, I mean, we can't always know, and it really depends on where one is teaching. There are certainly places in education where learning is very close to the ways in which people are going to use that later on. So one of the things I dabble in from time to time is medical education. And there it's really fun to think about, for example, residents learning in a didactic session over a lunch and then going to see a patient, right, later that afternoon where they're going to have to use that knowledge that they gained. So sometimes those things are closely coupled and we can kind of really predict when and what they're going to need to do. There are other times where, maybe you're teaching a first-year seminar at a university and you don't know exactly where those students are going to take and go with the things that you're trying to do in that course with them. And there it may be a little bit harder to predict. But there, I think also we oftentimes in education focus on some of those higher order skills that are different from kind of like the content knowledge or other kinds of things that a student might acquire in a course, critical thinking, et cetera. And those are things that we think about being able to transfer to other situations. So as we teach, I think we need to think about that, right? And there's some research that would suggest that the ways that you frame what you're trying to do in terms of those learning objectives in your course and helping students think about the fact that they're going to be able to use those in other situations really changes the ways that students engage and are able to use it later on. Yeah, great question. Thanks.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I just had a small question about the two studies that you discussed with 6,000 and 23,000 students.
Yeah.
So these were, if I noted correctly, these were students from high school and university level. Is that right?
Just high school, yeah.
High school.
I mean, so it's a dual enrollment, which means that they're high school students and they're enrolled in a high school class, but also a college class at the same time. So I guess technically they are college students, but they're still at the high school level.
Okay.
And yeah.
So I think my question was around, by that age, as a high schooler, there are already set ways in which students are doing things and are learning. So if we talk about encouraging better ways of learning and motivational strategies, when does it start? Like at what age should we start?
Very early, I think. I mean, so I just did a thing with my kids' school. So I have three children, 11, 9, and 4. And so they're in an elementary school. And one of the things I got to do last year was be the visiting scholar at the school, which was very interesting. And I got to interact with the teachers and really learn about what their practices and the way they approach things and share some of what I know. And one of the things that I saw in abundance in what they did was the very things that I'm talking about, right? So for example, one of the activities that they do starting, I think, in kindergarten is have students do some sort of a share where they study something, they give a talk then eventually, right? And it's video recorded. And then afterwards, they have them reflect on that experience. So there's an actual like in-class assignment where they think back, well, how did you devote enough time to this? Did you present in the way that you were, intending to, et cetera, et cetera? That reflection piece is right there. Now, I think the key thing is, because I'm sure that all of us do these same kind of things in what we do, is labeling them for students. This is why I'm doing this. And I do think that we as teachers oftentimes don't do a good enough job explaining to students why we're doing what we're doing, right? And helping them understand how that's going to help their learning. So doing some of that labeling and doing it from a very young age, right? So that students are starting to see these skills show up in what they're doing. And I think would be really important. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Andrew.
Oh, sorry. Hey, yeah.
Looking at the challenges that a young undergraduate may be facing in his or her transition from secondary school or high school to the university in making choices. So how do you help such a student in understanding the difference between the urgency and important? So I want to know, because what you presented about Tina is all about choices, and some may be very important and are not urgent. Some may be urgent and not important. So how do we help such a young student?
And students are going to interpret some of those things that are maybe not so important as being really important, right? Or vice versa. That's a great question. So the way that I think that one of the things that happens also when you get to university, and it depends on the opportunities available at your high school, but you are confronted with an abundance of opportunities, right? Abundance of choices to make about how you use your time. And I think that we all need to be realistic to think, one part of going to university is the academic piece, right? But there's all these other pieces as well, and we need to value those also. So helping students to navigate that, I think, is a very challenging thing, right? Because to some extent, it's up to individual students as to, what is the best way to devote their time. It may be that for one student, right, the answers to that might be very different from the other student. So ultimately, I think that we should give students a lot of autonomy in their ability to make choices, but help them to make informed choices, right? And help them to the extent that they make certain choices and set certain goals, right, to be able to follow through and achieve those goals, or to recognize when, maybe they should abandon those goals and take a different path. Yeah, I think, does that answer your question? I'm going to go off on 50 tangents if I'm not careful. Okay.
If you don't mind, we'll take 3 more questions, and then
Oh,
I think
all right.
we'll leave it there.
Sounds good.
Your example of your youngster who's in kindergarten made me also think about, have you ever looked at the influence of the teacher's age and life experience with learning in terms of using learning strategies and motivational strategies as they influence students?
That's a great question. No, I mean, I have not had the opportunity to do that, but I think that that's a really interesting question. This is not studied enough. I mean, if you look at the research on, especially in the K-12 space, on teachers supporting students' learning of strategies, there's some work by David Orenstein and a few others, but there's certainly a lot more work to be done and a lot more questions to be asked. And that would be a great one. And what would be your hypothesis there? That as experience increases, that they know more to be able to do these things, or?
I think perhaps the teacher's opportunities for self-learning herself, themselves, so that they've pursued other things as to how to teach better.
Yeah.
Their openness for that, their exposure to theoretical principles of learning and teaching, could influence it. I'm wondering about age. I'm wondering about this system of schooling, because we see this in even some of the cognitive testing that we do even with older patients, because I work clinically with older patients, and you can see a difference in their ability to do abstract thinking and reasoning, irrespective of illness or cognitive disorder.
Oh, interesting.
And so you wonder about the same thing. And as an old teacher, I say, oh my goodness, we have to look at new styles. So then I think of andragogy and adults learning and their motivation for learning. Therefore, I'm not teaching a grade school child to just learn arithmetic or something, or times tables. That's more rote. I'm trying to teach to think and reason and the lifelong learning. And my students say to me, oh, another assignment or another reflection. But I'm telling them that this is going to be for the rest of their life, because they're going to go home after work and reflect on what they did, so that it's then applicable. And it's exactly what you said. It's going to apply down the road. It's not just for the course.
Well, I think that, the professional development piece is a very complex piece, right? That we know is oftentimes the uptake and the ability to even just cover some stuff is minimal, right? And when that's in the K-12 space, but also in higher ed space. You all are the minority who are here learning about all these things, right? There are plenty of other people who, right, are not here, or not in similar kinds of learning situations,
Your
right?
students should watch this talk, and you can say, see, it's not just me.
Yeah.
Other people think this too.
Andy, we have a question from our online audience.
Oh, yay.
I'd love to briefly hear your thoughts on how neglect of self-care, such as sleep deprivation or an increase in unproductive screen time, might also impact student learning.
Oh, very much so. I love, so in the courses that I teach where I try to do some of this stuff, I show students a lot of the research that is very well documented how screen time, but especially sleep, has negative effects on just about everything. I have a friend, Mike Scullin, who's at Baylor University, who does a lot of work on sleep and education, and He's got a great study that I think is perfect for this kind of thing that if anyone wants to email me, I'd be happy to send it to you, where he does this intervention with students and he pays students to get 8 hours of sleep during exam period, right? And he pays students, one group of students, and he gives the other group of students, right? They can regulate their sleep however they want. And he shows that their grade goes up by the group that slept 8 hours goes up by about a letter grade. And and yet, right, I think that again, the knowledge is an insufficient but necessary condition, right? And so getting students to not go to bed at 4 in the morning, and you see the timestamps, right, on when people are turning in assignments, their circadian rhythms are different than ours, so we should be not too judgmental, right? But getting enough sleep, regardless of when you're getting it, and minimizing screen time so that you have time to do other things are important, yeah.
Hi, Andy. I just had a question. You mentioned that study strategies didn't differ by demographic.
Yeah.
So that made me think that there would be no difference in performance. And then you mentioned that first-generation females from marginalized communities were more motivated, and that made me think that they would perform better. So I feel like there's a conflict there, and I was wondering if you could clarify a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we have to remember and frame all of this as understanding that we work within a system, right, which has systemic biases and leads to hindering individuals with certain social identities, right, from having success. I can see how you would think that there's a conflict there. These are kind of initial data points, so I would not read into them too. We need to know a lot more, right? I do think that the learning strategy piece tells only part of the story, in the sense that, maybe, there are just a few things that the average student does to learn, right? But that study was not able to really capture the full scope of the planning, right? How much did you do, dosage, the specific ways in which they use them, et cetera. So there's a lot more to understand there. But at the gross level, it was interesting that there doesn't seem to be any differences in the patterns, right? And not that you would necessarily predict that there would be a priori, right? I think this is a place where you could make certain predictions, but I don't think you would necessarily have that hypothesis. The motivation piece may be a little different, right? In the sense that I do think you could come up with some a priori predictions about why students with certain social identities might need to use a greater number and/or amount of motivational strategies. There's some other interesting areas of research that we've kind of connected. I can give you a paper for it if you'd like, because we've submitted it if you don't share it. And there's another literature which I did not know about until recently that's called the it's about how people's effort doesn't pay off. They've got a catchy little sorry, I'm not gonna be able to pull it out of my brain at the moment, but I'll remember it in about 15 minutes. It's the same kind of idea, right? Is like you would make the prediction that if people are putting in more effort that they should be succeeding, and yet they don't, right? And I really think that the way to interpret a lot of that is not about the failures of the individual, but is about, right, the systems that surround them. And that we have created situations in which people can produce more effort, use more effective learning strategies, it doesn't pay off, right? So that's something we need to really think about.